welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. In this episode, I'm talking to Agrii's Regional Technical Advisor, Tim Horton, and agronomist and farmer, Mark Dews. With farming facing significant change, today we're going to look at farm productivity and viability and ask and find out how Agrii's Green Horizons initiative helps us to deliver these two key elements on farm, balancing the science with the economics. This podcast episode qualifies for BASIS and NRoSO Points. So let's start by finding out a little bit more about our experts. Good morning to you, gents.
Good morning.
Morning.
Morning. So Tim, first, tell us a bit about what you do as a regional technical advisor.
Okay, I provide technical support for several of our agronomy teams in the southwest of England, ranging from sort of Northampton down to the Isle of Wight, going west into Cornwall, and back around the square of that area.
Crikey, Tim, that's hardly the southwest. That's half of the country from Northampton down.
Well, that's where the teams operate. I obviously work with the agronomists in those areas, and hopefully try and keep them their understanding of what's changing from an agronomic point of view up to speed, and help them with their decision making and things that they need to know to do their job effectively.
Sure. And I mean, seriously, that's in terms of cropping and soil types and farm types, that's going to be quite a range of differences, isn't it?
Absolutely. And you get very different pressures from a disease and other factors down in the southwest than you do up in Northampton area. They're dealing with very different problems in the different areas. Blackgrass in one part of the country is a major issue, but you go further south and west, and it's more meadowgrass and different challenges down there. So it ranges enormously in terms of what the challenge is, depending on where the agronomists are working and what they're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I understand, talking to you earlier, that you also have your own farms that you're looking after and crops that you're walking.
Yeah, I still have an agronomy portfolio, less than it used to be, but still dealing with farms on the coal face. So I have an understanding of what the agronomists are dealing with from a practical point of view, as well as trying to help them steer them through the myriad of decisions they have to make.
So, Tim, that sounds like you have a really interesting role, both being an agronomist, but also offering that valuable technical support to your fellow agronomists out there in the field. And Mark, I understand that you are both an agronomist, but also a farmer. Tell us a bit more about where you farm and what you do.
Okay, I am a farmer in Warwickshire, and I've been an agronomist for 25 years. So I work in surrounding counties, Leicestershire, Warwickshire. I go a bit further east into Bedfordshire and Cambridgeshire. My own farm is an arable farm with sheep, and we are on some fairly marginal kind of soil types, probably clays that become quite difficult to farm profitable in crops other than wheat. So that's a challenge that sort of faces a lot of my customers and ourselves on our own farm, and we've done a lot of things to kind of integrate livestock, to bring different break crops into our farming operations, and I've developed a interest in some of the more sustainable kind of approaches to farming, and that has kind of gone alongside with the Green Horizons development at Agrii, where we're looking at some of the more sustainability issues involved in arable farming. So our interests align pretty well on that.
That's great. So we can talk a bit more about that. And it's fantastic that you're both farming and an agronomist to really sort of walk that talk literally. So it'd be great to hear what you've learned and what you're finding out. And I understand from our discussion just now that what you're saying was the combines parked up, as many farmers' combines are, waiting for it to settle a bit with this difficult weather. So let's get into the conversation from the point of view. Let's start with the MAP report that I understand is a farm benchmarking tool tool that's really current at the moment. Maybe Tim, what is the MAP report?
It's an agronomic tool. So we use a standardized pricing structure to allow us to look at the agronomic performance of farms across soil types. And we very much look at the soil type performance and allow farms to see how they're performing each year. They get a personalized report to show where their figures fit into the wider scheme of things. And it allows us to help the farmers with their decision making in terms of planning and really reflecting what they are achieving and how they're moving forwards.
And is this a unique tool, so to speak, that's offered to Agrii clients?
It is different to what else is out in the market because it very much works from the agronomic side of things rather than just taking account type numbers and looking at those. So it's very much looking at things from an agronomic point of view and really trying to improve the agronomic decision making of farmers and their agronomists as a team.
So if we're talking about agronomic performance, can you give me an example of some of the detail that's in that report?
So, for example, we look at drilling date of, say, oilseed rate, and that's changed recently in that it used to always be the late drillings that were always performing better. But with the advent of the cabbage stem flea beetle, we're now actually seeing earlier drillings performing best, mainly because the crop establishment has been more reliable. That may change this year because this year has proved another challenging year for oilseed rate.
Yeah, and Mark, as a farmer, do you use this tool?
Yeah, we have done that on our own farm, and I've also introduced it to several of my customers' farms too. And it's a really useful way of focusing on which areas we're doing well on and which areas we need to improve on. So traditionally the MAP reports have focused around a more Tim's area really in that kind of southern part of the country, but we've tried to increase the geographical spread over the last year or two, and we've now got quite a good little comparison group going kind of in the North Midlands up into Derbyshire and some of my colleagues in this area. We've now got a reasonable start with some comparison groups in that area, and it really helps to compare with similar production systems and similar soil types to see where we stand, who's doing better than us and which areas that we're spending too little or too much on, and really working out where we should concentrate our management approach on in improving our financial performance.
Yeah, and that financial performance is absolutely key at the end of the day, isn't it? And today we're talking about productivity and viability. Just to help us clarify that, what are we talking about if we talk about productivity and viability? What do you understand by that, Tim?
Obviously, productivity is really a measure of how much you're producing, but the viability is more about actually whether you're making money in that production system. So it is really looking more at the sustainability of the process. So it's looking longer term in terms of how the processes are delivering a good, consistent result, hopefully year after year. It does vary soil type to soil type for different years, but the aim is to really produce a sustainable production system that is allowing the farmers still to make money over and above any support systems and make sure that their overall farming practices are robust and performing.
So it really sounds like you are using the MAP tool to glean that understanding of what's happening in terms of productivity and balancing that with viability. So with that in mind, and you mentioned Green Horizons just now, how does it fit within Green Horizons? How does it help us achieve that initiative?
I would sort of look at it from the point of view that it's a way of making sure that your decision making is remaining sustainable. It's that sustainable side of things. And as people are adapting and changing their systems, it's a way of measuring how that change is working and making sure it's still sustainable in terms of the overall result.
And of course, Tim, that must be good news for farmers and agronomists alike. From your perspective, Mark, as an agronomist but wearing your farmer's hat, so to speak, how do you see the Green Horizons initiative working for you and its fit in terms of productivity and viability?
I think Green Horizons builds on the kind of financial sustainability that the MAP report focuses on. So, I've just dug out the MAP report that we did for our farm and looking at the gross margin performance for individual crops and then translating that into a gross margin for the whole farm. And that gives us a good idea of the relative profitability of our farm compared to others, and also on similar soil types and also between our crops. So we can look at our rotation and see, it's all very well having a really profitable first wheat, but then the first wheat can only ever occupy half of the farm. So we need to look at what that profitability is like across the farm and what different choices kind of affect that profitability. But the Green Horizons expands that consideration into the area of sustainability, which is pretty overused word, but to me it describes our ability to continue doing what we're doing. So we need to look at the wider considerations of the environmental sustainability, the sustainability of the product use, considering soil health and all these other factors that will hopefully allow us to build systems which can continue to make profitable production with acceptable external costs. And those external costs are starting to come under scrutiny through legislation. So you've only got to look at something like the very recent farming rules for water, where we're experiencing some significant limitations on the way we can use organic manures in the autumn on arable crops. And that's a sort of an external factor that we hadn't had to factor in until now. But now where we're using organic manures, then we've got to really consider the way we're using them, and we've been heavily pushed towards spring application. And so the Green Horizons pulls in a framework for us to consider all of these different wide-ranging factors and brings them all under in the one kind of umbrella strategy where we can consider them all together. Green Horizons doesn't provide us the answers to every question, but it just gives us a way of thinking about some of those external factors that just purely the financial consideration doesn't always take into account.
Yeah, and there's always a lot to be balancing in terms of decision-making when it comes to producing a crop. That's farming, isn't it? One area that I know that you've been thinking very carefully about is plant protection inputs. Tell me a bit about that.
So I have spent quite a lot of time developing and considering evaluating the different pesticide measuring metrics. So when we were talking about external costs, so there's a lot of talk about carbon and farming in a carbon neutral way. So we get to net carbon by 2030 or 2040, whoever's targets we're talking about. And so in order to achieve that and to measure that, then we have to have a measurement system. And there's a development of a range of different carbon measuring systems, which is going ahead now. Alongside that, there is a consideration about pesticide use measurements. And currently we have the pesticide use survey, which is the only kind of aggregate pesticide use set of numbers that we have for the country. And that's pretty clumsy. We're talking about total number of treated hectares or total amount of weight used per hectare. And they're not very fine detail measurements. And what I've been looking at is a number of different systems which are used in other countries which may well appear here, and we should be developing those and considering how we can implement them into our production systems, how we can monitor what we're doing and get some useful output. I would far rather that we do that work as an industry and kind of develop that and show that we are taking a responsible attitude to the use of these pesticides that we rely on, rather than having something imposed upon us through legislation. We've just seen this business about organic manures that I've just been talking about imposed on the industry very, very suddenly with not great consideration about the way it's going to be implemented by farmers. And I would like to see us develop something workable for the pesticide use, so that we've got something we could present to legislators and say, this might work. This is the way we would like to monitor our use of these active ingredients, which clearly do have some unintended impact on the wider environment. And I've tried to learn from what's happened in some other countries, particularly Denmark and France and other European countries, so that we can see what we can implement here.
So coming back to the key question that we're asking ourselves in this podcast, which is, how do you as a farmer and an agronomist, by looking at plant protection inputs, how does that impact and how does that help you in terms of productivity and viability?
So that's something that I've done on my own farm, and I've done on some of my customers' farms, and we've been using a measure called treatment frequency index. And treatment frequency index is the cumulative use of full rate equivalents across the life of a crop. So if I use a full rate herbicide, a half rate fungicide, and a full rate insecticide on a crop, then my treatment frequency index would be 2.5. So that, in very simple terms, that's how the measurement works. And by measuring our pesticide use in that way, we can track the trends and how that use differs from year to year, and what kind of a sort of a rolling average we can look at how we're behaving and what that does to our pesticide use trends. And so we're at these kind of early stages with this. We've done it with a number of customers. I've done it on my own farm. And what we're seeing is quite a lot of volatility, which is absolutely appropriate, because we want to be adjusting our pesticide use according to the pressures of the season. And I think the numbers that we've done so far demonstrate that. What I would like to start to see is to see a downward trend in that use, so that we can work towards systems where we are actually reducing our external impact. And a further development from that treatment frequency index measure is to start to weight those pesticides for their negative impact, so that if I'm using a full rate of a particularly benign substance, then that would attract less weighting points than one which has got some more negative impact for the environment. And there are a number of different ways that can be done, and I've been evaluating those different systems, and I'm kind of plumping towards something which is used in Europe called the Harmonised risk indicator, and that's where we're sort of evolving to with the work that we're doing so far.
Interesting. And Tim, I see you nodding there, listening to Mark. What are your thoughts on, how we can manage our plant protection inputs with a view of fitting within this Green Horizons initiative?
Certainly, as we go forwards, we're obviously, we're losing more active ingredients as well, but we need to be aware of certainly the environmental impacts of what we're doing and try and minimise that while still growing profitable crops economically. So it is always going to be a balance. But the more information and tools we have available to us, the better the quality of decision making we can carry through, and therefore we can hopefully continue to make improvements going forwards, do things better, and also work within the development of the Green Horizons idea of reducing the impact on the environment and maintaining good sustainability across the whole profile.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the environment, and within the Green Horizons Initiative, biodiversity is a key element, isn't it? So how does that managing our plant protection inputs help us enhance biodiversity on a farm? Tim, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, biodiversity obviously encompasses a big area, including things like cover crops and all of those things in the rotation. And if we can, for example, use less insecticides by using a better integrated system, then we're definitely going to improve our biodiversity. And also from another point of view, do we need to control every single weed in the field? We know our problem weeds that we need to control, but there are other weeds that are more benign, and in lower numbers, you may not need to actually chase after them. And perhaps it's a thing we need to learn to do, is to accept that a few weeds here and there aren't necessarily always an issue.
And so I guess, Tim, every time you make a decision whether to use a product and apply it to a crop, that will have an impact directly on productivity and viability, won't it?
Every time you're making a decision, you're trying to work out what the return on that investment is. And it will vary from one situation to another. And certainly building in that understanding as to what the wider impact of that decision is from a biodiversity side of things needs to be part of that decision making. And lots of people do it automatically, but we need to find ways of justifying that by actually putting some information behind it.
Okay, so another area I want to touch on, which features very significantly within the Green Horizons Initiative, is towards net zero. How do we look at that in terms of productivity and viability on farm? Mark, what are your thoughts?
There are starting to become a number of carbon trading schemes where farms will be rewarded financially for some of the practices that they go through with, which sequester more carbon and release less carbon. And I think that's going hand in hand and alongside other financial rewards for good practice. So public funds for public goods has been a phrase for the last few years as we've talked about agricultural policy reform. And I think going back to the kind of pesticide use kind of discussion, then I'd like to see that form part of the biodiversity debate and some of the reward for enhancing biodiversity. So we've got the ELMS schemes, which are being formulated now, and carbon is bound to form part of that, as will biodiversity gain. And through a more considered approach to pesticide use, then I'd like to think that we can kind of attract some environmental payments through that scheme to reward some of the financial kind of impediment that could be imposed upon people's financial performance through making responsible choices about pesticide use. So and that would then feed back through into the financial performance that gets measured through the MAP report. So a lot of people talk about the sustainability of our farms with just the environmental considerations in mind, but obviously we've got to be profitable in order to be able to carry out this responsible farming that we're all involved with. So the two things link hand in hand, the financial performance and sustainability alongside with the environmental sustainability. And where public kind of goods and public money are involved in that equation, then I think they need to recognise the fact that if we are making sacrifices to profitability in order to achieve environmental gain, then that needs to be acknowledged and rewarded in some ways. And I'd like to see those things incorporated in the same way as carbon is starting to become a financially traded asset, then biodiversity or effect on biodiversity is something that I'd like to see be rewarded. Now that is starting to happen in a private factor in terms of biodiversity net gain offsets for developers. That's starting to become a consideration where developers might consider paying farmers to conduct environmental sustainable practices that enhance biodiversity, but also in that kind of public funding area as well with the ELMs, with the environmental land management schemes. So those are the areas that I think overlap. But in order to achieve all those things, we have to have ways to measure our progress. And just in the way that there are a number of different carbon accounting systems out there, then I think we are starting to develop a number of different pesticide use accounting systems too. We're in a really interesting phase of agricultural development where we're starting to consider a much wider kind of measurement and kind of judgment of the way that we're performing in this really important role that we play in the ecosystem and the food production system.
Thanks, Mark. And for you, Tim, what does towards net zero mean for you, looking at farms in the area that you cover?
Obviously, the biggest part of the carbon equation is fertilizer. And so one of the things we need to learn to do is to keep growing profitable crops, but perhaps using less artificial fertilizer and trying to make better use of the other parts that the soil is using our soils more effectively to give us a better sustainable performance from farm production. Towards net zero is it encompasses quite a wide range of aspects, some of which will be offsetting the carbon, but other areas will be looking at ways of just reducing our reliance on the main carbon things, of which fertilizer is probably the biggest element.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground during this podcast. If we were to try and bring all of this together, and drawing on your experience and skills as agronomists and as a farmer in the field, what would be your top tip to the listeners today, to the industry actually as a whole? So who would like to go first with that challenging question to finish up on?
Yeah, okay. My top tip is let's start measuring our plant protection product use, our pesticide use. Start to measure it so that we get some sort of a baseline about what we're using. Now, doing that with various different farmers and with using different systems, and over a period of time, then a front runner will emerge out of that, and I think it will be treatment frequency index. I'd like to see that related to productivity. So with one farm that we've done it with, then we've tried to relate it back to units per ton, so that we're taking into account the productivity as well as the actual use. So we're not just talking about use per hectare, we're talking about the use per ton. And I think over a period of time, we'll develop that into a more nuanced and useful figure. But let's just start doing it so that we've got somewhere to work from, so that we can build up a picture of where we've been and then start to measure our progress. It's something that hasn't been considered very, very closely so far. I think that we'll be compelled to do it through legislation in the coming years. Let's get a head start on it, and let's start to understand what the impact of how we can measure it and what differences that could make.
And Tim, considering the huge area that you look after, what are your thoughts?
I think the better we can understand our soils, our farms as a building block for sustainable production, then the more likely we are to be able to start implementing these different areas. So the more understanding we have of where our start point is, as Mark said, whether that's from a soil point of view, from a crop protection point of view, and then we've got a baseline to work from, and then we can look at the influences of what we do and how that takes things forward.
Well, thank you, Tim and Mark, for a very interesting discussion today on farm productivity and viability and the fit within Agrii's Green Horizons initiative. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you'd like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.